Dr. Anthony J. is the president of the International Medical Research Collaborative, a nonprofit organization based in Boston that trains medical students from around the globe. He is also the CEO of AJ Consulting Company, which specializes in scientific consulting, speaking, and personalized DNA analysis. Dr. J has a PhD in biochemistry from Boston University School of Medicine and a BA with a double major in biology and theology from Ave Maria University in Florida. He is the author of the book Rejuvenation: How Estrogenics Are Making You Fat, Sick, and Infertile. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Anthony J. to the show. All right, Dr. J, welcome to the show. I've been so excited about this interview. I think your book, Rejuvenation, all about estrogenics and all of these endocrine disrupting chemicals that are present from our water supply to, our self-care products. It's making a major impact on this generation, on our kids, and on our future health. So such an important topic. Thank you so much for donating your time to this show and helping us educate the audience.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So I love to start from the beginning. If you could explain what are estrogenics and what are endocrine disrupting chemicals?
Sure. Yeah. Well, estrogenics it just means anything that acts like estrogen in your body. And that could be real, actual estrogen, right? And there's three estrogens. There's estrone, there's estriol, and there's estradiol. So that's an estrogenic. But the real problem in our country and our culture is there's fake estrogens. There's chemicals that act like estrogen. And they do that because there's three different estrogens. And, like for testosterone, it's very simple. There's testosterone, there's one receptor in your body that picks up testosterone. So it's going around your body and your blood, and there's little receptors. Just think of like a little hand grabbing something out. It grabs onto testosterone, and that's it. Simple. With estrogen, I've already mentioned there's three different estrogens, but there's two receptors. So there's a lot going on with estrogen, and scientists call the estrogen receptor promiscuous, which is kind of a funny description, but that's a technical description. That's what they call it, meaning it's like it binds to a lot of different partners. Mm-hmm. And the problem with that is it's susceptible to binding a lot of different things that we are making as chemicals from petroleum products, specifically in plastics. That's a particularly bad area, because a lot of these plastic chemicals act like estrogen in our bodies. And then that causes all kinds of hormonal issues. Fragrances too, they're really susceptible to acting like estrogen in our body. And there's a few other things too. I mean, like soy is another example, and a lot of these sunscreen chemicals and on and on. I made a whole top 10 list in my book because there's so many of them. And it's not just a top 10 list of chemicals that could act like estrogen. It's chemicals that act like estrogen and chemicals that we're exposed to every day. So like Agent Orange, for example, that acts like estrogen in your body. It's an estrogenic, but you're not exposed to Agent Orange. I don't really care about writing about Agent Orange, right? So it's not in my top 10 list, but plastics are, and sunscreens are. It's at least certain sunscreens that have these chemicals, and on, etc.
Wow. So can we talk about the three different types of estrogen and the chemicals? Are they acting like specific estrogens, or are they just docking on those estrogen receptors and blocking our true estrogen?
Yeah, well, the three different estrogens are less important than the two estrogen receptors that pick them up, because these estrogens are docking on the receptor, like you said. And so those receptors are more important to understand. And because there's two, they call them alpha and beta: estrogen receptor alpha, estrogen receptor beta. So I just think of it as alpha and beta. And it's a little confusing because alpha, it's a cultural term. Like people are like going alpha male or something, or beta male or whatever. But don't get sucked into that. Just ignore your brain if you're trying to think alpha and beta in that regard. It's just like number one and number two. An alpha receptor is the problematic receptor for estrogen, meaning it's good for you if you're sexually developing in the womb. You need that alpha receptor turned on. It's like flipping on a light switch. Just think of an alpha light switch and a beta light switch. Alpha receptor, you switch it on in the womb when you're developing, you switch it off for the rest of your life for the most part, and that's the way it should be. If you're flipping that light switch back on, that receptor back on, the alpha receptor, you're going to increase risk of breast cancer, if you do it later in life, you're flipping on the alpha receptor as an adult. And the beta receptor, on the other hand, that's the good one. That's actually the light switch you want to turn on as an adult. Estrogen is very positive. It's very beneficial, our natural estrogens, because they bind to this beta receptor when we're adults and even through childhood and things like that. And they're protective against breast cancer. For men, they're protective against prostate cancer. They're protective against Alzheimer's, protective against heart disease. They have a lot of benefits. So as you can imagine, if you trigger the alpha receptor with fake petroleum-based chemicals, and you say, hey, I've got a bunch of this estrogen receptor activation, I've got this light switch turned on, your body's going to be confused. Breast cancer is up 250% since 1980, for example, in America. And that's not because we're not passing out enough pink ribbons, right? It's because we're being exposed to more and more and more of these chemicals. Some countries are up 500% in breast cancer, and it's the countries that are manufacturing more of these plastics and then shipping them over to America. So, it's a problem because we're raising awareness for breast cancer, just thinking specifically about that. But we're not talking about the real problem, like with the root cause of the problem. And that's where it's coming from. It's coming from alpha activation. You're turning on that light switch. You're not supposed to be. But in other cases, these chemicals can bind to the beta receptor and block it and do all kinds of things. So it's just all types of nefarious problems with these estrogen receptors. And it's a little bit complicated. It's unfortunately complicated, but hopefully that sheds a little light into how it works.
Definitely. It's just interesting to me that the alpha receptor is only triggered in the womb. And what's the story behind that? When it's triggered in the womb, what's it doing?
So when an egg and a sperm cell fuse together, of course, you're basically just a one cell organism with 2 copies of DNA. And every cell in our bodies as adults, we have 2 copies of DNA. Except egg and sperm cells. Egg and sperm cells only have 1 copy each. So basically when egg and sperm cells fuse together, those cells start dividing and growing, and you get an embryo and a fetus and all this. And there's a point where you have sexual development. And at that point, you get alpha activation. That's just one of the progress points that you have through development. I don't know that much more about it. Other than it's necessary, because if you manipulate that during the fetal stage, you get all types of sexual development disruptions, physical disruptions in your sexual organs and things like that.
Wow. So interesting. I guess probably even more important, obviously, to avoid anything that's alpha activating prior to getting pregnancy, during pregnancy, in such a critical period of time. Okay. So let's talk about your list of the top 10 estrogenics that activate the alpha receptor when we don't want it being activated, and that probably dock to the beta receptor as well, doing, as you said, nefarious things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So I kind of have different categories for it. Like some of them would be like food. I would say like food is one category, and then plastics would be another category, and maybe personal care products would be another category. In the category of food, I'm thinking of soy. I'm thinking of red food coloring. I'm thinking of mold. Mold can secrete estrogens. The mold toxins, people have heard of mold toxins and they know mold is toxic. I don't want to breathe that stuff in. When you have mold remediation in your house, they come in with a hazmat suit. They're not messing around, because those mold toxins can totally disrupt your hormones, and that can last years. That's going to be literally years of health problems just waiting to happen. And one of the reasons for that is because molds secrete a chemical called zearalenone. It's ZEARA, ZERALENONE or something, zearalenone. But scientists usually just abbreviate it ZEA. And ZEA is a nasty estrogen disrupting chemical. It messes with your hormones. And this wouldn't be such a problem, but in America, we don't have an upper safety limit on ZEA in our food. And grains are notorious for having quite a bit of mold, especially in our modern storage facilities and things where we have bigger and bigger and bigger storage and mass production of foods. And the grains are just, they have a certain amount of dampness and wetness, and you get some mold. Whereas in Europe, by the way, they have a safety limit on their mold for ZEA, for mold tox, for zearalenone specifically in their food. And not only that, the craziest thing is they have a safety limit for their animal feeds in Europe. And it gets worse, because if in Europe you've got like some horse feed that doesn't make the cut for the grains, because it has too much zearalenone, too much estrogen from the mold, they can ship it to America and use it in human food, and they do this. Yeah, so it's really sad, and unfortunately, we don't
devastating.
regulate this. It's insane, yeah. And this is one of the reasons I don't like grains, even if you're not a celiac or gluten sensitive and all this. Just in general, I'm very nervous about grains for most people. And organic is better, blah blah blah, but the mold issue doesn't go away necessarily in a lot of situations just because it's organic or whatever, although it is better.
Can we talk about mold other than grains and the ZEA marker? Are there other foods that are notorious for mold? I mean, Dave Asprey has done a good job telling us that there's mold all over our coffee. But can we talk about the other foods that may have this problem?
Yeah, good question. Thanks. So grains in general, and peanuts are the worst ones. I think peanuts, and that's why peanut allergies are so common, in my opinion. I think it's actually ultimately from the mold toxins that are in there. And, we've got such a problem with leaky gut, where people's guts are leaking food particles into their bloodstream, and their immune system is attacking these particles. I think it's that simple, though. It's mostly just grains, peanuts, coffee. And I would actually say coffee would be the least offensive on that category. If you're just buying reasonably good coffee, you're pretty good. You're pretty well off from the studies I've seen, but there's still a gradient. If you're getting really cheap coffee, stop. Like, it's not worth it. You are probably getting a lot of mold in there. But yeah, I think it's those three. Those are the big ones. And the other one I mentioned earlier, of course, would be soy. So just soy in and of itself acts like estrogen. Everybody knows this, by the way. Like, nobody debates whether soy acts like estrogen. All the scientists agree. What some people debate about is whether it's a good estrogen or a bad estrogen. And that's where it gets complicated. And that's where I'm glad we set the stage here, because now that there's two receptors, alpha, bad, beta is good in this case. That's where the debate comes in, because soy activates both those receptors. But it depends on the study, it depends on the person, it depends on the cells that you're pulling out of somebody's body. But it activates both. I've seen enough studies. Now, you don't want to activate both. You just want to activate beta. And, so again, you can make an argument like, oh, it's okay for a lot of people if they have good genetics and all this. And I do genetic consulting, and I look at people's genes for alpha and beta receptors. And you can find people that can handle soy just fine. I'm always nervous about it, though, because number one, when you do a scientific study with estrogens, imagine all the plastics we're exposed to, right? It's just insane. And I'm coming up on plastics. We haven't even talked about plastics, but you can imagine how many plastics are in our environment and our air and all this stuff. And they're acting like estrogen. So number one, we're pretty heavily saturated with estrogen chemicals in our body, especially in America. And then you throw soy in there in a group of people. You have two groups of people. One of them, you give them some soy. The other one, you don't give them soy. You wait 6 weeks, nothing happens. You say, look, soy is fine. Well, the problem is you are adding more estrogen to their systems. Again, everybody agrees with that. And because we're so saturated out with estrogen, you may or may not see it within 6 weeks. It might take 5 years or something, but that doesn't mean it's okay necessarily. Again, you could make an argument, maybe it is in some cases, but I'm nervous about it. Again, it definitely acts like estrogen. That's enough for me. So hopefully that at least clears it up a little bit.
Well, it's interesting because I wrote about phytoestrogens in soy in my book in 2016, Body Love. And it's just, coming from 8 years in cancer and genetics and moving into having a private practice in nutrition and going back to school for that, it was really interesting in the classes to have teachers tout the benefits of soy being anti-cancer, but then coming from cancer and genetics, PubMed research articles showing that there's tumor activity and tumor growth with specific phytoestrogens calling out soy. It was really convoluted. I'd have, a breast cancer oncologist at St. John's who was a hardcore vegan who would eat soy based on a few studies. And then I would have the opposite side of a coin where I'd have specific oncologists say to steer clear of it, with a 10-foot pole. And so for me, it's it's like, if there's a chance of a negative outcome, I'm
Yep.
going to steer clear, and I'm going to stay on the side of caution and be really just careful with it. I think when it comes to soy products in my house, we have gluten-free tamari that I'll use like once every couple of months. And I even have coconut aminos in there. And like, I rarely am using this, and I'm always like looking to keep it out. But it's interesting because I will get a lot of comments around how it's protective, and it's hard for me because if someone's just coming out of traditional schooling and they don't have the background of potential tumor growth and things of that nature, they're going to tout what they learned in school, which is soys are protective. They protect you against any type of estrogenic cancer, like breast cancer, ovarian cancer. And I'm just like, the house is on fire, run.
I know. They say that about birth control and stuff too, and they manipulate this stuff. Whenever there's a lot of money involved, there's a lot of manipulation and a lot of nonsense. That's why you have to really dig into the research, which is difficult and a lot of work. And most people don't do it. So they're just falling back on what they've been told about it.
Right.
And so it's hit or miss what they've been told about it. And I've done the research. I've dug into it very deep. And, I'm, to say the least, I'm nervous about it. But by the way, it is worth mentioning that if you ferment soy, like if you have actual fermented soy sauce, there's basically no estrogen in there.
Great.
And it's the same with natto.
Like natto. Yeah,
all this stuff. So if it's fermented, it's fine. And the units are like astonishing. I mean, like actual soy, it's like they did a study in Canada with over 100 food items. And basically all plants, they tested like broccoli and kale and whatever, like over 100 different plants for estrogen, phytoestrogen, plant estrogen. And all of them were under 1,000 units, except for soy and flax, which were over 100,000 units of estrogen. So it was like a night and day difference in terms of all the plants are over here and soy and flax are way over here, over 100,000. But if you ferment the soy or the flax, you get under 100 units of estrogen. So it's like you go from 100,000 down to 100, which is basically just a nothing dose,
Wow. Okay. We need to unpack flax a little bit more then, because it's definitely something that, whether that's like a flax cracker or a seed that I'm putting in a smoothie, or, now there's all kinds of flax products on the market. Can we talk about it?
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, flax is interesting.
How do you ferment it?
You generally don't, but your gut bacteria can do it for you. If you have a healthy gut, you're generally fine with flax. It has something called lignans, whereas soy has something called isoflavones. They're a different type of estrogen. And gut bacteria love lignans. They love to chew them up. But it's a big assumption in America to assume that people have good gut bacteria. Now, your audience may have good gut bacteria compared to most people, but most people in America don't. So, and people often know if they have good, I mean, you can kind of tell, like, you probably don't do flax in that situation. Even though, by the way, flax has CBD, right? Everybody talks about hemp and CBD, but flax has CBD. So there's anti-inflammatory properties to flax, and there's omega-3s, of course. So there's other side benefits, but it's like, well, get your omega-3s from fish, and then you're not playing with quite so much fire, potentially. So I am a fan of just being nervous about flax as well, or being cautious, I should say, about flax in our culture. Me personally, but I'm okay if people want to do it. I'm not judgy about any of this stuff, by the way. And by the way, when I go to the airport and I travel, I get a plastic bottle once in a while, right? Like you have to. I don't want to be that guy like, oh, look at Anthony J. I got a picture of him at the airport with a plastic bottle, right? Like it's going to happen to all of us. And the main thing is to understand what you're doing and to recognize, like, I don't want all 10 of these every single day for the next 20 years in my life, right?
Right.
It's a quantity thing.
Totally. I mean, one of the things, my mom had breast cancer. So many women deal with breast cancer. She was lucky that it was a specific, low severity style and like something that is easily taken care of with surgery. but it's hard, it's hard on any woman that has breast cancer. And one of the biggest pet peeves I had would be the flats of Arrowhead water bottles that my dad would buy at Costco and keep in the garage. And they live in an area that's like
Hot.
hot, like 10
Yep.
miles inland from the ocean, 80 degrees all the time. And I'm just like, that's it. Pull the ripcord. You're getting like, I know we're just reallocating these funds to a glass water bottle delivery. If you're unwilling to get like an RO system or a Berkey on your counter, like I need you to stop buying this stuff
Yeah.
because people are creatures of habit. And if it's ease and the water bottle's there and they'll just grab it and go to golf or to see their friends and it's in the car and passing it out to us and our kids is easy. It's like, we got to just nip this in the bud.
Exactly. And it's wasteful. It's ending up in the oceans and things too. This idea that we're recycling this stuff is not really true a lot of the time. But yeah, I mean, I was just on a scuba diving trip doing some training in Alabama, and outside the gas stations, they've got like crates of these plastic bottles, and it's like 104 degrees down there when I was down there. And I was just thinking like, oh my gosh, this is horrible. How much of these plastics are like the sheer amount of the estrogens that are leaching in because of this heat. But even if you brought them inside and had them air conditioned 6 months later, people would assume that they've been air conditioned all this time. And you don't really know the history of those bottles. And I have a big stainless steel tank. It's 10 gallons and I fill it up at home with my reverse osmosis. And by the way, my reverse osmosis is called Purify Guru. And it's stainless steel. It doesn't have a big plastic tank under the sink. It has stainless steel cartridges. They even made a silicone tube by my request. I requested it a couple of years ago and they finally made it. And they sent me an email and said, hey, try this out. We haven't sold this yet. Try this out. It's a silicone tube that's like got a stainless steel braiding around it so it doesn't blow up like a balloon. So even the tube from the reverse osmosis up to the sink is now no longer plastic. And I was okay with a little bit of plastic, but I thought, well, let's take it the next month. Let's take it the level up because there's zero plastic in this thing. And that's the only one that I know of that's just like unbelievable in that regard. And
that's awesome. I'll put that in the show notes for sure, because that's, going down the road of looking for reverse osmosis. And then I mean, we just purchased our first home. And so one of the most important things for me is the like water system and, whole house system and an RO. And it's like going down the rabbit hole of like, the house is piped with PEX. That's plastic piping.
I know.
Like that is.
They've done studies on phthalate levels from PEX and they're high, and they're not like outrageously high, but they're high enough after 10 years where you get nervous for sure.
Yeah. And it's like, okay, so now instead of a whole house RO system, are we doing individual ROs under like the kitchen sink and in the bathroom upstairs? So we have a place to get filtered water to drink that doesn't have that. And, it's a whole thing because ultimately I just don't want my boys in contact with all this estrogen all the time.
Exactly.
Okay.
Or you girls. I mean, girls are going into puberty super young too, because of all these chemicals at age 9 and things. And by the way, the medical journals, in response to the earlier and earlier puberty levels, there's scientific publications coming out now arguing that we should lower the normal range for women's puberty. It's because it used to be like 12, and once you get below 12 or something, they would say, oh, this is abnormal. But now they're trying to lower that all the way down to 9. And they've done this with testosterone too, because one of the side effects of having an inundation of these estrogen chemicals is it lowers men and women's testosterone. And then you lose your sex drive and a lot of other problems. I mean, if you have low testosterone, you just have generally low energy, for example, and other things. And they've lowered the normal ranges for men and women every 10 years, like on the dot. It's like in the 80s, I don't know the women's numbers off the top of my head as much, but in the 80s, the average male was 500. In the 90s, the average male was like 424. In the 2000s, the average male was like 350. And right now you see guys all the time at like 250. And the doctors, it used to be like the normal range was 500 to 1500, and they lowered it to 400 to 1500, and they lowered it to 300 to 1000. I mean, it's just completely nuts what they've done. And now they've got it down to 250 at a lot of clinics, down to 250 to 900 and stuff like this. It's insane. And for women, it's even worse because they oftentimes will say the normal range for women's testosterone is 0 to 100. Like, In
Why
other
would
words,
we have
zero is
that
okay.
hormone
Yeah, they'll
if
check
zero
your
is
blood
normal?
yeah, they'll have absolutely nothing. And then women will say, yes, I have depression and I have no sex drive. And the doctor will say, oh, that's strange because your blood test looks great. And you look at it and it's like, well, you have zero testosterone. Of course you have no sex drive and depression. And then they immediately get on like a cream or something with testosterone, and it's like completely resolves that. And it's like, what's wrong with these people telling them that's fine? You want to be like 50 on your testosterone. You don't even want to be 10. And some blood tests, it's like 7 to 70. Every company is a little different, but that's a 10-fold range, right? That's like saying go jogging for 10 miles or 100 miles. Like as if that's a similar, that's not even close to the same sort of experience if you go jog for 100 miles versus 10.
Wow. I mean, it's heartbreaking the way that diagnostic testing does ranges in general, whether it's sex hormones or thyroid hormones, because they're taking a group of sick people and changing the numbers based on that. Heartbreaking.
I know.
All right.
Well,
So
thyroid's another 10-fold range, right? TSH is 0.5 to 5 on most blood tests. It's completely crazy. So they basically have to be dying before they're going to tell you your thyroid's off or something.
Right. Oh, all right. So let's get back. First of all, I want to say thank you for being transparent about the fact that you might have a plastic water bottle at an airport, because I like to be a realist. Like, none of this is totally controllable 24/7, 365, but we can do our best to handle the biggest things. Like, if you're having soy and it isn't fermented, that's a red flag. If you have been diagnosed with leaky gut and you're having flax every day, that's a red flag. Red dyes, like, these are in a lot of processed fake foods. Avoiding those, looking for those, ensuring that you and your kids aren't ingesting those. Great thing to look out for. The mold piece, grains, peanuts, coffee, we'll call those out. And I would say we don't eat a lot of grains in my family, except for white rice occasionally. And it wasn't something that I personally ate a lot of even prior to getting pregnant. I kind of got into the grain-free movement and enjoyed it, but I know there are times when we do. And now that I have kids and they're hungry 24/7, and I'm going to have like a house of boys and be shopping at Costco for years, but it does help feed our family. But it's good to know. Is there anything we can do to look out for to ensure that our grains have a lower mold count? Or are there any companies that do anything to test for mold, companies that you can call out for the audience at all?
I'm sure there are. I don't know them off the top of my head. I just don't do grains that often. Although white rice is really good. I agree with you. And I actually do white rice plenty of times. And, once again, I choose white instead of brown because the brown has the husks on it. It's kind of tough on your gut lining. I have kind of a sensitive gut lining. So I'm right on the same page there.
Okay.
But yeah, in terms of other grains, I mean, my wife does some gluten-free baking sometimes, but I don't know exactly what she's using, but it's kind of custom to different people, right? Like I don't do very well with some of the gluten-free grains either. So she's got the ones that I do well with, but that's just me.
Yeah. Well, I think it's good just to call out that too. Like, everyone needs to check in with themselves and see, like, how are these foods feeling in their body? Do they have side effects? How's your digestion? How's your mood? How's your brain fog? All of those things. Okay. Let's jump into your other two categories, plastics and personal care. What do you want to attack first?
Well, let's talk personal care because we've talked a little bit about plastics. And I mean, I guess I can just generalize with plastics to save time and say, look, if it's plastic, it's probably got estrogens, right? I mean, even if it's BPA free, the companies have switched over to bisphenol S, BPS, or BPAF, or BP. I mean, there's literally an alphabet. You can just keep doing BPS, BPF, BPG, BP. You know what I mean? Like, you can just keep tagging different chemicals onto the BPA, and it's still acting like estrogen. Right. So even if it's BPA free, even if it's bisphenol free, it's probably got phthalates, and the phthalates are just as bad as the bisphenols. And I think the biggest thing with the plastics is they're pervasive. I mean, your shower curtains and stuff. Anytime there's like a lot of heat and a lot of like commotion with water or air movement, you're going to disrupt a lot of these plastic chemicals up into the air. So I prefer like a more natural shower curtain. That's something most people wouldn't think of. I prefer sheets that are not poly. I don't want plastic sheets from plastic fibers, like polyethylene, what's the word I'm thinking of? Like these, what I'm talking about, the poly sheets and poly blankets and all this kind of stuff, instead of just getting cotton.
It's like the jersey material.
The technical, exactly. That's plastic,
Yeah.
And it has a certain kind of shine to it and stuff. And it's okay if you're wearing some of that stuff, but you don't want it on your bed sheets, for example, because you're literally just breathing those plastics in all night long. They off gas just a little bit. And it's like, you don't want to be breathing it in 8 hours a night. Costs a little more for cotton. It's worth it, especially for the pillowcases. Even infant mattresses, they've done studies on infant mattresses, and because they're putting so much extra plastic around them, they find it's cancer causing levels just from the off gassing with some of those. So be really careful with infant mattresses. But then going over to the personal care products, and we can circle back to plastics if you want, but honestly, if you don't trust the company, or if you're not sure about the company, most of these companies are not trustworthy in terms of the estrogen chemicals they're putting into the products. They use the term fragrance on the label to hide a lot of these estrogen chemicals, like the phthalates and the parabens and the oxybenzones. And so it's not as simple as just, look on the label. And if the label says, if you can't find these words on a label, well, most of the time they just have the word fragrance and they lump them in there, and they're allowed to do that legally in America. China has stricter regulations on parabens than we have in America. Like, you don't want a bunch of parabens hidden in there that you don't know are in there. So my philosophy on personal care is go fragrance free if you're going to go cheap. You can get cheap personal care products. Just make sure they're fragrance free. You get cheap soap, cheap bar soap, cheap shampoo, all this stuff. I have a list on my website of the stuff that I personally use, and it's pretty cheap because I've got 5 kids, Yeah. And it's like we burn through this stuff. And you can get good quality stuff too. There's a lot of great companies out there that you can trust, and they use essential oils and they use natural fragrances and things. And you can have fragrance things. Just don't get like these ridiculous like outlet plug-in things with these chemicals you pour into the top that they're like spraying into the air all day and things like that, and you don't have any idea what's in there. I'm telling you what's in there. It's estrogen chemicals made from petroleum. They're super cheap. You can buy truckloads of this stuff for almost nothing, and these companies do. So that's the big thing with the fragrances and the personal care products. People are rubbing these lotions on their skin, even in the shampoo. Like, they do these studies. It's amazing how much your body absorbs with these chemicals. Even something like shampoo, where you're putting it in your hair, so you don't even think you're putting it on your skin, and then you're washing it off, but it's going all down your back. And like, I don't even use shampoo, right? I don't have any hair. People that are listening. But it's amazing. Like, if you use conditioner and you wash it down, you can feel like how greasy it is on your back, which I don't have that experience anymore, but I used to, so I know the difference.
Right.
But your skin absorbs things like a sponge, and these estrogen chemicals in particular, it will absorb just like a patch of estrogen on your skin. These chemicals are hydrophobic. They're afraid of water. Technically, they love to stay on your skin. They love to stay in your clothing when you do a laundry wash. When we go to our in-laws, they still have a lot of fragrancy stuff, like fragranced,
like Tide and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And when of course, like I said, I got 5 kids. So of course we have to do a load of laundry sometimes, and we'll do a load of laundry there. And the clothes smell like fragrance, even after we bring them home and do like 2 or 3 more loads of that same laundry in fragrance-free detergent. You can still smell the Tide. It stays with your clothing. And scientists have even done dermal uptake studies with clothing from those fragrance chemicals, and they find it increases your blood levels. Is it like a toxic level in your blood? No, but it's increasing your blood, meaning it's actually having an impact on your health in the long term. Because these chemicals store up in your fat, they store in your body. That's something that a lot of people overlook. They think, it's not toxic, so it's okay. But it's like, well, if you're building them up in your system, it's not okay, number one. And number two, these chemicals aren't really toxins because they trick your body into thinking that they're hormones. So your body doesn't perceive them as toxic. It's not like you're poisoning yourself. you're messing with your hormones. They're not good for you, but these chemicals are tricky to study from a toxicity perspective, because if you put BPA, if you have some cells growing in a little plastic dish, by the way, these plastic dishes, which is ridiculous. So already you've selected out the cells that can't handle living in plastic. So already you have a bad scientific experiment, because you've killed most of the cells in that dish. Ask a scientist. If you know any scientists, I'm a scientist. If you know a scientist who's grown cells in a dish, say, like, if you take some cells out of your fat or your muscles or whatever, you put them in a plastic dish, do all of them survive? And they'll say, oh, hell no, all of them don't survive. You'll kill like 80% of them. Only about 20% will survive. Well, you're putting them in plastic. Of course, they're not going to survive. So you've already killed like 80% of your cells that can't handle like hormone disruption. And then now you've got growing cells in a plastic dish. You put BPA in there, right? And lo and behold, the cells don't die. Like, unless you put a ridiculous amount in there. And so scientists say, look, BPA is not toxic at all. You have to put a ridiculous amount in there before it's toxic. And therefore, the safety limit should be like sky high. And I look at it and say, well, yeah, but look way down here at this tiny little minuscule amount. It disrupts your hormones. And now, thankfully, people have caught on the BPA thing, right? Like that information was coming out even before I published my book. And what I've done with my book is opened the Pandora's box of all the other chemicals that are doing the same darn thing. But, that's the problem with the conventional toxicity model is body over time. Sorry to go on a rant there.
No, I think it's really important to point out, most people don't realize how we set upper limits for toxicity. And it's truly like cell death versus hormonal changes in our body that could have devastating effects on our daily life. So, really important to point that out. I am curious, I told you before the show started, I did a bunch of labs recently, post having 2 babies back to back and breastfeeding 2 babies back to back. I wanted to check in with my body, where I was at, nutrient levels, gut test, checking for calprotectin levels in stool testing, things like that. I wanted to know, am I cutting out?
No, you're good.
Okay, sorry. I wanted to check calprotectin levels in my stool testing. I wanted to see, was there inflammation? Was there leaky gut? Like, what was going on? I just went through like a miscarriage before my first son. I went through basically like 5 years of being pregnant, not being pregnant, breastfeeding, and all the things. And I was so surprised to see that I had a couple of plastics in my, plastic byproduct chemicals in my bloodstream. And, the doctor that I work with was like, you need to be in a sauna 2 to 3 times a week. We need to detox this. If people do have estrogenics, plastics, fragrances from personal care products, from their, detergents, what are the best ways to detox these things? Because our body isn't, like you said, it isn't flagging it as a toxin. It's flagging it as a hormone and putting it in fat cells. Like, how do we get rid of this stuff?
Yeah, good question. Well, your doctor is right. I mean, the sauna is the best thing. Sweating is the best thing. It doesn't have to be the sauna, because these chemicals come out in sweat. And it's funny, because literally 10 years ago, they would laugh at you if you said that. They laughed at me when I was asking about it, 15 years ago. And then the studies, they didn't even have studies, and they were laughing at people asking these questions. And now that they have studies, there's so many studies out there showing you sweat this stuff out. There's review studies of all the studies. And if you want to Google them, they're called BUS studies, blood, urine, and sweat, BUS, blood, urine, and sweat. Look up BUS study phthalates, BUS study BPA, things like that. And what you find is people barely urinate out these chemicals. Like, you check their urine, and there's not that much in there. That's there, but it's not that much. It's surprising. And by the way, if like children have higher levels of urinary BPA and things, they have a lot higher levels of depression and crazy things that you wouldn't expect to see in children. So it's a problem if your levels are high, but most people don't have high levels in their urine, and they have those same people go into the sauna and sweat, and they measure their sweat, and it's like full of these estrogen chemicals. So, if you're not sweating during your workouts, sweat in the sauna. Make sure you get some sweating in. 3 times a week seems to be the minimal effective dose, at least sweating for 10 minutes 3 times per week. That's from the 20-year sauna studies over in Finland that they've done. But yeah, it's important. I think that's the best thing other than just avoidance. It's not really complicated. You don't have to do a lot of other stuff, because if you're already avoiding them for the most part, and then you add in the sweating, you're a rock star compared to most people these days.
All right. Well, motivation to get in my sauna 3 times a week, or at least get that hot yoga back in my life. Okay. So personal care products. I mean, I do have to say, when you pull out fragrances from the majority of your personal care, your laundry, I'm sure you felt this way when you washed your kids' clothes at your in-laws, that it is so strong and pungent. It almost is headache inducing.
Gross. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I love
Yeah.
our babysitter to death. Like, she supports us and comes a couple of days a week and gives us a couple hours to like grocery shop or be with one kid while we were with the other. And I had to ask her at one point, like, every time you come in our house, it's just really strong. And then I had to share the science and then give her a list of things she could change to. But I mean, it's in everything from like dry shampoo to hairspray, like you said, all the shampoo and conditioner, but so pungent, and those artificial fragrance for laundry, just so strong.
Well, not to mention straight perfume that people are spraying on top of that. Yeah.
Don't
just give her my book,
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So let's dip down into plastics for the last few minutes we have together, just so that people know where are the biggest offenders? How can we pull the plastics from our lives? What are the things you can look out for? I know you said plastic water bottles, shower curtains. That's a great call.
Well, coffee too, right? Like, people are cooking, they're heating up water, and then they're running it through all types of plastic tubing and plastic things, and then it's percolating out their coffee makers. What I've done now, I used to do pour overs, but it takes a little bit of time, and they taste great and they're good, and I roast my own beans and the whole thing, so I'm a snob on this. But what I've done now is I grind a bunch of, like, a whole pound of coffee beans, put in a big glass jar overnight at room temp, and just make cold press. I just filter out the grinds the next day, and I keep the filtered coffee in the fridge. But I don't like cold coffee, so I just heat it up every day, and that's how I do coffee now, and it tastes amazing. I think it's better.
Sounds less acidic too.
Yeah, it's less caffeine. It's interesting flavor. It's a little different, but I think it's better. So that's a couple options with the coffee, I think, that are worth pursuing for people. Anytime you're heating liquids and plastics, right? People ask me all the time, like, well, what about Tupperware with your carrots or something? It's like, well, it's not really liquid. Solids aren't gonna, if you have a solid food like an apple in a plastic jar, you're not gonna get enough leaching. It's so trivial, it's just not even worth thinking about. But if you've got liquid, even if it's room temperature, you're gonna get some leaching. The more you heat it up, the more leaching you're gonna get. The more oily something is, the more leaching you're gonna get. Never buy oils in plastics, because oils transfer, the estrogens transfer into the oils much quicker than waters. So if you buy olive oil, awesome, olive oil is good. Just, make sure it's not cut with canola oil. Like, a lot of these companies have cheated and they've cut it with canola oil over the years. And thankfully, they've been flagged for that, but make sure it's in glass, right? And that's just particularly true with liquid. Some people buy supplements like MCT oil, and then it comes in the mail, and oh my gosh, it's a plastic jar, which drives me crazy, because the MCT is so, it just draws those chemicals out. So glass jars for that, stainless steel water bottles. I had mentioned the airport, but it was probably a bad example, because most of the time when I go to the airport, I do bring a plastic or a stainless steel water bottle, and I just have it empty, and then I fill it at the water filter stations. So you can kind of develop a lifestyle around this that works really well, and it's not so wasteful, and it's not that expensive. Let's see, plastics. I think that's about it. I mean, do you have anything to add to that? You probably have some ideas.
I mean, you called out a lot of the biggest offenders. Like, one of the things that just, I've had Leo Trezande on the show before, and
he's awesome.
He's awesome. And that was like my last season. And, one of the takeaways there for me was a Yeti stainless steel coffee cup, or sitting at the coffee shop and having it in a ceramic cup, versus you know, all the to-go
The
coffee
plastic.
cups
Oh,
that
good
are
call.
lined with
Exactly.
plastic, because again,
Paper
that's
cups, which aren't really paper. Yeah.
right. I
Well, the
think
other
that's
thing,
the hard part, is like even
well,
cans, like all
that's
these
what I was gonna
people,
say.
all these people that are drinking out of like the
Soda cans.
Spindrifts or the soda, like, and they're BPA free cans. And,
No,
you know, there's
they're
something in
plastic
me where I'm
lined.
like, okay, I love a good Spindrift, or like a sparkling, you know, no natural flavors, sparkling, whatever. But I do have this moment where I'm like, there's something about it where I'm like, this doesn't feel right. Like I want to
Yeah.
stick to
No,
like
those
Mountain
plastic
Valley or
liners.
something.
Yeah, the plastic liners in aluminum cans are plastic, you know, and if they're BPA free, they're almost always phthalates. They're plastic number 1, polyethylene terephthalate. That's what plastic number 1 is. If you look on the recycling, someone has a little number 1, that's phthalates. That's polyethylene terephthalate.
Yeah.
What I do is I get a drink mate thing, and I just, with the CO2 cartridge in the back, and I just pressurize my own. I get cold water in a glass pitcher in the fridge, pour it into the thing, shoot CO2 into it, put some essential oil like tangerine oil or something, a little stevia, boom, I got my soda. The other thing is masks, like plastic masks that people are wearing have a lot of particulate that comes into their lungs and microplastics. And most masks, these cheap masks, they're all plastic, you know, unfortunately. So people need to watch out for that these days. And I almost always forget to mention that, but I need to, because it is a big source for some people.
Right. Speaking of like breathing in plastics, where else and when else are we breathing in these plastics other than our masks?
Well, outside of the masks, the new car smell is a big one. If you live in a really hot environment and you walk out to the car and it's just like this reeking of the new car smell. Most people like that because it tricks your brain. You think it's like a hormone, you think it's estrogen, you think it's really attractive. You don't realize your brain is being tricked. It's an estrogen, and it's mostly oxybenzone. It's mostly the sunscreen chemicals that they put in the plastic, but it's also a little bit of the phthalates and stuff. And what you want to do is roll your windows down and flush that out while you first start driving, then roll them back up, because it's super concentrated when your car has been sitting in the heat. And by the way, I barely mentioned sunscreen, but I want to mention it. It's so important. You can't use oxybenzone. It's nasty. It's becoming more and more illegal in more and more countries because it's killing so much wildlife and it's causing infertility in wildlife. And it's like, well, yeah, but the people too, right, are being affected. And you don't want to be that person being impacted by it or having your kids impacted by those sunscreens. Use zinc sunscreen if you're going to use sunscreen.
Yeah, definitely.
No oxybenzone.
Shout out to Think Baby. They're not sponsoring the podcast, but we go to the beach and my husband calls himself a kook because he's like covered in white zinc all over his face and in his beard.
Well, I've just come to, well, what I do is I set a timer for 20 minutes. So I can do it 20 minutes and I get the benefits of the sunshine. And then I put a sun buff and a sun hat and the sun gloves even, and sun shirt and sun pants. I have the whole thing. But when I do the crazy white sunscreen, if you get your hands wet first, and you can lather a lot thinner.
Oh, that's good.
And then it's not quite so like thick and white and crazy looking. Just for the record, that's how I do it.
That's a good call. We'll definitely have to do that. And I'm going to have to get your tips. I'll have to get your recipe for your cold brew coffee that you heat up, and for your CO2 cartridge for your homemade sodas, because that sounds
well, it's all
amazing.
I don't have a recipe. I just kind of put a drop of essential oil in and call it a day. I don't really think through it very much.
No, I mean, that's great. Just even getting the like CO2 cartridge thing that you use, maybe from Amazon or wherever you grab it.
Yeah, it makes a big difference. Yeah, because I love CO2 water, just like most people. It is. I'm glad that's a trend. It's much better than drinking sugary soda and all that.
Definitely. All right. When we close up, let's talk about how these estrogenics affect and feminize males and little boys, and how they might be harmful to children and little girls as well. What's happening?
Yeah, for sure. Well, unfortunately, it's a bit of a reversal, meaning if you expose, and this is animal studies, right? Because in animals, you can accelerate these things and give them a pretty high dose and hit them hard, and you can see what happens. And what you see is for the male, mice or rats or rabbits or whatever you're messing with, you get male feminization, and that's a physical thing. Like testosterone goes down. That's a form of male feminization. You're moving towards a more female phenotype. You get physical structural differences in sex organs and things like that. In fact, with frogs, you can turn a male frog straight up into a female with just 200 nanograms per deciliter of atrazine. If you just put it out in their environment, if you just put the water in their environment, you turn a male frog to a female with 200 nanograms per deciliter. And in America, the drinking water, the legal limit is 3,000 nanograms per deciliter, just so you know. And if you look up atrazine and feminization, scientists, they used to use the word feminization, male feminization, all the time. Now it's not politically correct, and scientists are afraid to touch it with a 10-foot pole, but it happened. And it changes sex drive, and it causes apathy in males. And for women, it's a little tricky because it almost androgenizes women. Like, it almost does the opposite, where it moves you more towards a male. And it's confusing, and it's really complicated and technical, but that's what you see. I mean, a lot of times you see more masculinized women and more feminized men when you expose them to high doses of these chemicals. And of course, there's a spectrum, and it varies. And but that's basically what you see. It's harder to quantify in women, but it has been done, and that's what. And it does vary based on the chemical. You know what I mean? It's such a complicated thing because, again, I mean, I mentioned phthalates, and I keep just throwing out this word phthalates, but there's really like hundreds of phthalates. You know, phthalates is a huge category. Parabens, there's hundreds of parabens. There's methylparaben, there's propylparaben, there's butylparaben. Scientists aren't studying all of these chemicals, and you just have to err on the side of skepticism instead of the side of assuming that they're good for you if we don't have the studies to prove it. That's my opinion.
Guilty until proven otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
With man-made artificial chemicals. I mean, these things aren't found in nature, right? So our ancestors were never exposed to these chemicals for thousands of years. Why should you? You know, why should you assume that they'd be okay, our bodies would be okay with it? Why would our gut bacteria be okay with it if we've never seen them before, even if they're not that toxic? I mean, toxins are bad. Classic toxins that cause cancer, sure, they're bad, but these ones aren't really the classic toxins. They're also bad. So I think that's a good place to end, like as a take home, is just to be extra skeptical.
Definitely. Well, we're going to put links to your personal care products, all your specialty drinks, the list of 10 everyday estrogenics, a link to your book so people can give it a read. Is it on Audible?
Oh yeah. Right. Hardcover, softcover, Audible, everything. E-book.
All right. Well, get off this podcast, go download it, and go download Dr. J's book. And I'll put links to everything in the show notes. We don't want an estrogeneration, and we're stuck in one. So let's get ourselves out of it. Let's protect our kids. Let's protect our families. It's not going to be perfect, but just even knowing these things and knowing to avoid them is a major step in the right direction. So thank you so much for being here, for sharing your science, and for beating this drum for all of us.
Oh, thank you. I mean, really impressed with your interview style and your questions and your insights, and I appreciate you taking the time to hang out with me. So I just talk.
I just love, like, honestly, I just want to be a student, continue to learn, like use this platform as a way to help anyone who follows along change their life. So you're doing the hard science to do it, and helping so many families who have somewhere between 1 and 5 children keep their kids safe. So I really appreciate it. Well, thanks for your time.
Thanks. Have a good day.
You too.